The other day, I had a long conversation with a person about what appears to be the long slide into immorality and valuelessness in the West. Does God have a message for his people who live in a valueless and immoral society like ours appears to increasingly be? I think that he does. Get your coffee. It is probably too big of a generalization, but it is close enough to be true. So it is mostly right to say that a greater portion of American Protestant Christians are more politically conservative than not. That being the case, the midterms last week didn't go quite the way that a lot of people I read or listen to or interact with expected them to go. The expectation on both the right and the left was that last week's elections were going to sweep through like a massive red wave. A red wave it was not. And now, sitting here nearly a week after the election, with the dust beginning to settle, it looks as though the GOP did not do anywhere near what they expected. They did take the House of Representatives, but not to the level that they wanted or anticipated. And they did not, or at least this is the way that it currently appears to be, they did not take the Senate. The President of the United States on the Democratic left cannot declare victory for his party or his administration, but the defeat was such that it is now becoming a little more clear that Joe Biden is much better positioned for a 2024 run than he was just 10 days ago, which is strange because, like him or hate him, President Biden is less than a week away from his 80th birthday. Based upon everything in the news leading up to last week's election, I was under the impression that a red wave was coming and that the president's party would soon turn against him and slowly begin to move in the direction of identifying a new party champion for 2024. That may now not be the case. As hard as it is for individuals on both the right and the left in the United States, it is important for all of us to assess reality as it is and not as we would like it to be. What exactly do I mean? Well, the reality is our nation is more evenly divided than we might be willing to accept or admit. One of the huge proofs of this is something that happened in my own state of California. For those on Team Blue, the U.S. is more red than they think, and vice versa. I am a Californian through and through, and a SoCal Californian 100%. I was born and raised in San Diego, but I am also at the same time a Protestant Christian pastor. Living in Southern California as a Protestant Christian pastor is like exiles living in Babylon. The culture, especially in 2022, does not value the things that I value or teach others to value. But there are Christians and even Christian pastors in my state that are convinced that of the nearly 40 million people that live in California, the majority hold to a biblically informed value or ethics system. I've said for a long time that that is not exactly true and might actually be a bit absurd. But still, I've heard Christian pastors, some of them who have huge platforms, much, much bigger than mine. I've heard them say that if all the Christians in California would just rise up and speak up, that we would take this state back. That rhetoric sounds really good, and I do wish that it were true, but I don't think that it coheres with reality or the facts on the ground, shall we say. And that was clearly evident with one of the ballot initiatives in California last week. On the ballot in California was Proposition 1. Now, to my shame, I didn't even realize that Proposition was on the ballot until the moment that I opened my absentee ballot and began to go through it a few days before the election. Proposition 1 made abortion a constitutional right in the state of California. It passed by more than 65% in my state. As a Christian, that outcome is horrific. But I see outcomes in elections as a referendum on where we as the electorate are at that point. And California is wholly and completely post-Christian. What that means is that it will be increasingly difficult to be a publicly faithful Christian in California. Now, I don't really have a choice but to be publicly faithful. I'm a Christian pastor, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I want to be publicly faithful as a follower of Christ. But it will be increasingly difficult to be faithful to your convictions as a follower of Christ in California. And ultimately, I believe that this is a part of a major refining process. The church is being refined, or to use another image, it is being pruned or winnowed. That is, again, in the ultimate sense, a good thing, but it isn't an easy thing. For many years, as I taught through the book of Isaiah at a local Bible college, I taught my students that the purpose of punishment is purification. During the time that the prophet Isaiah spoke, God allowed his people to be punished. First at the hands of the Assyrians in the 8th century BC, and then at the hands of the Babylonians in the 6th century BC. And the purpose of that punishment was the purification of God's people. They would be pruned, winnowed, and refined down to a very small remnant of the truly faithful. We, Christians and churches in California, and increasingly so in the rest of the United States, are beginning to experience the refining process of the furnace of affliction. Is America experiencing the punishment of God? That's a good question that people wrestle with, and I think a worthwhile question to ask. Are Christians in America experiencing God's punishment? Sometimes it does seem like it. I certainly think that God is allowing us to reap the consequences of our choices, which you could make a great case that is a form of punishment. God is allowing us to experience the purifying and refining heat of the furnace of affliction, and the heat of the furnace is going to get hotter. We, those that have a worldview informed by the principles and values of the Bible, are sensing that the heat is increasing. Life in the post-Christian world we live in is going to become more and more difficult. And like Lot, thousands of years ago in the city of Sodom, we are going to be vexed, tormented, and oppressed by the valuelessness and the immorality of the culture, of the conduct around us. So, what is the proper response to these things? Well, I think there's a passage in the book of Jeremiah that speaks in a sense to this, where we read this in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 4. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all who were carried away captive, whom I have caused to be carried away from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and dwell in them. Plant gardens and eat their fruit. Take wives and beget sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, so that they may bear sons and daughters, that you may be increased there and not diminished. And seek the peace of the city where I have caused you to be carried away captive, and pray to the Lord for it. For in its peace you will have peace. For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, do not let your prophets and your diviners who are in your midst deceive you, nor listen to your dreams, which you cause to be dreamed. For they prophesy falsely to you in my name. I have not sent them, says the Lord. In other words, the prophet Jeremiah says, learn to live in Babylon. You might be there for a while. We may not like the sound of that, but it certainly is something to think about. We'll see you next time.